Now, the fact that our ancestors, as the Beta Israel, who were sold, or the Falashas, who were sold into these Western lands, is a fact. It's indisputable, even though they're trying to change and rewrite and disguise and deny our story, our history. You understand? This is an active spiritual warfare. You got to recognize. You got to know this. This is why we also have to be diligent. You understand? In keeping our story. You understand? Keeping our story fresh, keeping the remembrance, the memory. You understand? It's very important, our memory and our ancestral wisdom. This is what we study during the sabbatical studies, is our ancestral wisdom. So it's very important that we keep that in mind, and we don't go or fall into a mindlessness. You understand? As many of our people, many of us have come out and are coming out of such mindlessness and are grounding ourselves on the rock of eternal truth. You understand? Now, what's interesting is that the prophecy, the prophetical aspects are still revealing themselves in our present day and time, but many are blind to how the same thing that as it was then is still now, because there's nothing new under the sun. So there's a certain template for it, and it's the mythos that helped to provide us a template. So Joseph becoming the Adon, or the Aten, over the land of Egypt, the land of the Kabata, the Kabasa, you understand, or the Habasha, or Coptos land, the Egypt land, the double land, or the double earth in Egypt, in the Amenta. The Amenta was the lands of the West. So we have been sold into slavery in these Western lands. And here's what's interesting. When we read and study, Deuteronomy, when we get into Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 15 to 68, and we get to roughly around verse 68, it speaks to us, very interestingly enough, it speaks to us about Egypt. Egypt is mentioned in those curses that are proclaimed on those who would go astray and would go away from the spirit and the truth of the revelation and the way of life. Speaking of our ancestors, the reason, you understand, the logic for how we got and how we're in this present position, you know, in this present condition, rather, the condition and the position, but mainly the condition, this PTSD, post-traumatic slave disorder, where we are in Egypt. Now, there was a dream, there was a vision that was revealed to Pharaoh, or to Pharaoh. Now, many have tried to figure out, well, exactly who is that Pharaoh? Who is that particular Pharaoh? But Macy has given good insight and very clear insight into who this Pharaoh was, according to the mythos. And this is what we would like to address, hereby address in this particular portion, as it goes along quite well with understanding this chapter 41 of this sabbatical reading and feeding. So let's first go over some of the basics of this, where it says, and it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river. Speaking of the Hape, or the river of Egypt, the very same river that is the border, according to Genesis chapter 15, verse 18, is the border of our inheritance. Beyond that was to enter into the western lands, or was going and aiming, pointing west. Now it says, and behold, there came up out of the river 7 well-favored kine, those are cows, and fat-fleshed, and they fed in a meadow. And behold, 7 other kine, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ill-favored and lean-fleshed, and stood by the other kine, or the other cows, upon the brink of the river. And the ill-favored and lean-fleshed keen did eat up the 7 well-favored and fat keen. So Pharaoh awoke, and he slept and dreamed the second time. So Pharaoh, or Pharaoh, had more than one dream. And here's the second dream that he dreamed in verse 5. And behold, 7 ears of corn came up upon one stalk, rank and good. And behold, 7 thin ears, and blasted with the east wind, sprung up after them. And the 7 thin ears devoured the 7 rank and full ears. And Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So he had a dream. You know, he had a dream. Doesn't this also connect with our story? He had a dream. Now, Joseph is the typical dreamer. Joseph, or Joseph, Iusef, or Sif, was and is the typical dreamer and diviner in his youth. And if Yo, or EU, the Seif, or the Sif of Atum Aray, the Machetem of the Arai, be not an interpreter of dreams, Yosef was the revealer of the future by means of dreams. So now the connection with the wisdom that Muse was learned, and Muse, the author of this very book. So to comprehend it in its proper context, we will have to view it from the perspective or the mindset or with the basic knowledge of the author of this book. And we're speaking about Genesis, and we're in Genesis chapter 41. Now, after Pharaoh had his second dream, something interesting happens. Now, ones would ask, well, how come Pharaoh, you understand, how come Pharaoh is never specified? Joe Macy says something very interesting here on page 510. He says, doubtless there was, quote, corn in Egypt, end quote, which was at all times par excellence, the land of corn. But the typical corn land of the religious mysteries, the Mishtir, is in Amenta, or the western lands, or where we're at right now, this spiritual Egypt, where our ancestors were sold like Joseph or Joseph into, where the corn germinates periodically from the buried body of Osiris or Osar. Now, here's where it's very important to understand the Mishtir, and here's where many who are unstable and unlearned twist Scripture, because we need go no farther than the papyrus of Ani to see from whence the legend of the 7 keen, or the cows, the 7 cows, were derived. Now, in the Hebrew margin, it is related that Pharaoh, what we've just read right here, or Pharaoh, you understand, who is never specified, and that is as it would or should be if Ray, the Rai, the vision, or what is known as the solar God, or the God the Father. When it says solar God, for us as Hebrews, we say God the Father. The solar God is meant, dreamed or dreamt that 7 keen or cow came up out of the river that were fat and well-favored, and 7 other keen that were lean and ill-favored. Now, it's about to be interpreted by Joseph, Eusif, right? Verse 8 of Genesis 41 says this, and it came to pass in the morning that his, speaking of Pharaoh's, spirit was troubled, and he sent and he called for all the magicians, all the magi of Egypt, and all the wise men thereof. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was none. There was none that could interpret them to Pharaoh. Then spake the chief butler to Pharaoh, saying, I do remember my faults this day. Now, why does the chief butler, you understand, say this? Because at the end of chapter 40, it says that the chief baker was hung, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph. So the chief butler, who was told the proper interpretation of his dream and regained favor with Pharaoh, the chief butler didn't remember Joseph, but he had forgot him after he was restored because of the interpretation of Joseph's vision.
And when the Lamb opened
he was
the seventh
restored,
seal,
but he did
silence
not remember. So
covered the sky.